Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Johnson says Hegseth possibly sending Marines to anti-ICE riots, not heavy-handed, deterring effect from FoxNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added this passage from the article. You don't think sending the Marines into the streets of an American city is heavy-handed, Carl interjected. We have to be prepared to do what is necessary, and I think they noticed that they might might have the deterring effect, Johnson said. And my thoughts on that are, personally, I think sending the Marines this early might not be the best call, but I definitely do think if the rioters were right coded and the president was a Democrat currently, all the rioters would be saying you gotta send the Marines and restore order. But since the rioters are left coded and the president is a Republican currently, sending in the Marines is suddenly the worst thing ever, And ultimately, whenever there's a riot, people usually want state to restore order. Whenever there's chaos, the state is usually expected to restore order, I would say. But since the state is controlled by the out group right now rather than the in group, at least in Reddit size, they won't like that. So, personally, I don't really care for the state, but if they want to send any force to stop any riots they want to, they can justify whatever they want to since they have a monopoly on legal use of force. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have petition to make Elon join the Libertarian Party. Elon has been showing signs of becoming hardcore conservative / libertarian, and let's give him a big push. Posted by Solid Reveal 2350, and that's a link to a change.org petition. Petition for Elon Musk to join Libertarian Party. And yeah, personally, I think the Libertarian Party has kind of too much baggage right now for Elon to join it. But if Elon wants to join, I'd support it. I don't think he should be forced to join it if he doesn't want to. But yeah, I do think he's better off starting his own party because the Libertarian kind of has a negative stigma in the eyes of a lot of people. So I think he'd probably be better off starting his third party. But that being his own party. But that being said, I welcome with open arms to the Libertarian Party. A lot of people might say, oh, he's a fascist, but, that's just the media narrative. The media loved him when he was a member of the political in-group, but then he joined the political out-group, and suddenly he was the worst thing ever. And then, but then people will say, what about all these controversies? And I'd say most of those are just him being kind of a cringy spurg. As a cringy spurg myself, let's not pretend that they make up both the vast majority of Reddit and the Libertarian Party already. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Newsom requests Trump admin return National Guard control to California from Newsweek.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, I personally think the National Guard should always be under the control of whatever state it's in, but Newsom has shown that he's just going to let the rioters riot since they're on his side. And when there are riots, the state is going to try and restore order. So I do think, the Orange Man is kind of justified in federalizing the National Guard since the state's not using them to quell the riot. The federal government might as well. But yeah, ultimately, I do think, that it shouldn't be as easy for the president to take over the National Guard as it is currently. That's why I support Defend the Guard legislation. I think, unless there's a formal declaration of war from Congress, the president shouldn't just be able to magically take over the National Guard and send them wherever he wants to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Texas is about to ban talking on college campuses at night, seriously, from HoustonChronicle.com. Posted by CH4Lux, and yeah, I think this is just more media sensationalism. That's pretty much all media sensationalism is. Texas lawmakers trying to cancel campus protests are just past one of the most restrictive speech bills in the country. Assuming Governor Greg Abbott signed Bill 292 would ban speech at night from study groups, newspaper reporting at public universities in the state. And yeah, I think that's that bill might be kind of stupidly worded, but I definitely don't want loud protests going on all night at public universities. Personally, I do think you have a right to freedom of assembly 24/7. But just because you have a right to freedom of assembly 24/7 doesn't mean you shouldn't face any consequences for it. If you're being overly noisy and people can't get sleep, that's where I would say, I don't think the state should be doing anything about it, because I don't think the state should be doing anything, period. But I definitely do think people should have a right to, quiet time at night if they were willing to enforce it. So I definitely understand where this bill is coming from, even if it might be a little awkwardly worded. Then we have GOP legislator threatens NHL hockey team over its Rainbow Pride Month logo. Watch for some significant legislation to this next session that pushes back onto these woke groups, from LGBTQNation.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, I personally don't think the government should be telling private companies what they can and can't do. I don't really care for all the Rainbow Pride circle jerk, especially during Pride Month. But if an NHL team wants to change its logo to a rainbow-colored one, that's not the government's say on what they can do with that. They can change their logo to whatever they want to, and I personally want to care for it, but that's freedom of expression. Then we have what from Donald Key, and that's from the MISC subreddit. And that's a tweet from Mehdi Hassan. This tweet aged well, and he quote tweeted an old tweet from Kristi Noem, I think the Secretary of Homeland Security, from last year. This is February 6, 2024. If Joe Biden federalizes the National Guard, that would be a direct attack on states' rights. Over the last several years, we've seen Democrats try to take away our freedom of religion, assembly, and speech. We can't let them take away our right to defend ourselves, too. And I would, agree. I would agree with that, but it just goes to show you, when her side wasn't in power, she thought federalizing the National Guard was tyranny, but now that her side is in power, it's entirely justified. And yeah, it just goes to show you, a lot of people, they don't have values when it comes to politics, only teams. Their side can do no wrong, but the other side can only do wrong. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. I always try and say it seems like I say that every episode of the podcast these days. Then we have new personnel policy requires all federal job applicants to write pro-MAGA essays, from peoplesworld.org, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, ultimately, I don't think they should be forced to write pro-MAGA essays if they don't feel like it. But ultimately, when you're applying for a job, the job can set any standards it wants to. And, I personally don't really care for how much the MAGA circle jerk the government is currently, but if they want that to be their policy, ultimately, that they're the ones in charge, so, they can justify doing whatever they want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have police deliberately shooting reporter at protest, posted by CH4Locks, and that's across from the law subreddit. Report shooting appears deliberate IMO, and that was how some Australian reporter got shot by police when she was reporting on the riots. And yeah, ultimately I don't think, you should be shooting at reporters or journalists who are just reporting. But ultimately, as I stated, the state has the monopoly on legal use of force, justified doing whatever it wants to, and usually you can't hold them accountable. Because they control the courts as well. So ultimately, just by doing whatever you want to, but sometimes you can't hold people accountable for shit like this, and that's just how it is sometimes. And yeah, I don't really care for it, but I don't really care for the riots in the first place either. So ultimately, if you want to justify what you justify, if you want to justify rioting, or if you remember the state wants to justify shooting at a journalist, just try doing whatever you feel like, I guess, I'm libertarian, I don't want telling people what to do. Then we have more protecting and serving, brought to you by LAPD. This is Trump's America, from Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the That's Insane subreddit. And it looks like a bunch of cops on horses, and looks like they trample one of the protesters under one of the horses, I guess, or rioters, I should say. I think it's interesting. Whenever it's the in-group doing it, it's the protest. Like for the right, January 6th was a peaceful protest, but for the left, it was the worst thing ever. And it's vice versa for the LA riots currently. But yeah, they trample one of the rioters. And yeah, I personally think that's a little too hard, but just because you're rioting in the middle of the street, doesn't mean, you're immune from all consequences. A lot of people on the left think these rioters shouldn't face any consequences whatsoever and should be allowed to riot all day and all night. And, that's something I personally don't really care for either. Ultimately, as I said in the last episode, I only wish that both sides could lose because, I don't really care for the state and their monopoly on the use of force, but I don't really care for these annoying Reddit communist rioters either. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Pentagon to deploy 700 Marines to Los Angeles, official says from Reuters.com. And yeah, we talked about this one earlier, I think. If they want to deploy the Marines, I think that's a little bit of an escalation. But, these riots do have to be quelled at some point, probably. You just can't have anarchy all the time. That's the difference between anarchy and libertarian. Libertarians need, you need to have at least some order. If people aren't having order, you do have to restore order. So I do think calling the Marines it's a little early, but I definitely can see a justification for it, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have support Turning Point USA from FunKale321, and that's a thing from the Turning Point USA, United States 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. And yeah, personally, I think Turning Point USA is more of like an arm of the GOP than a libertarian organization. But I definitely do agree with this sentiment. If the powers are not delegated in the Constitution, I think the state should have the right to do whatever they want in regards to whatever the situation is. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have This Isn't Rule of Law from posted by Helpful Feeding, and that's crosswords from the Flummoss subreddit. Chaos erupts at U.S. federal courthouse as ICE apprehends a man moments after his immigration hearing. And yeah, ultimately I don't really care for the state use of force, but the state can justify using whatever force it wants to and not be held accountable for it since they have the monopoly on legal use of force. Then we have LAPD mounted police report repeatedly trample protester for posted by Help Leading, and that's crosspost from the Flummoss subreddit. And yeah, I don't really care for that, as I said earlier, but ultimately the state has a monopoly on force to justify doing whatever it feels like. Then we have For the Bootlickers, Borders Are admits ICE detains people with no criminal record. That's what sanctuary cities get from LatinTimes.com, posted by Baton13, and that's crosspost from the San Diego subreddit. And yeah, ultimately, if they want to justify doing that, they have the monopoly on legal use of force to justify doing whatever they feel like. I personally don't really care for it, but I didn't really care for it when the Biden administration was cracking down on people who were questioning the vaccine either, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Taco McPresident hates most Americans, especially the troops, posted by Donald Key, and that's crossed from the Facepalm subreddit. That's a tweet from Gavin Newsom. You sent your troops here without fuel, food, water, or a place to sleep. Here they are, being forced to sleep on the floor, piled on top of one another. If anyone is treating our troops disrespectfully, it is you, at Real Donald Trump. And yeah, I personally do think, there should have been more planning and before the troops were deployed. But ultimately, you do have to quell the riot. You can't take at some point, you just can't plan all day. And yeah, I personally don't really think I think the troops probably should have had better accommodations, but ultimately, if they want to send them out there, I do think, the riot does have to be quelled at some point, arguably. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And yeah, it looks like that's all the new posts on the subreddit. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.